Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So Terracotta are continuing series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and it's been 48 hours since we revisited the Nintendo 64 core, so you know a bunch of stuff has updated. Robert or FPGAZumSpass has added in dedithering as well as anti-aliasing to the VI pipeline, so that Vaseline look for Nintendo 64 is totally here. But on different news, this is insane friends footage, he sent it over to me. People have patched out the TLB checks and memory addressing in Perfect Dark, so now with a patched game, you can actually play Perfect Dark on the current core. This in no way, shape, or forms means TLB has been implemented into the code yet, but because some games don't use it that often, you can actually get around it, but more on that shortly. So let's get right over to the big features of this current core. Running around as Mario here. If you can't tell already, the blur is in, but we need to really stop the screen because of YouTube compression and give you guys a close-up look at what's going on. So pay attention to all the textures, the clouds, the grass, the sky on that brick wall right there. Everything is blurry, everything is smooth, and that carpet on the right hand side also very even. If I turn off anti-aliasing or dedithering, you're going to see that the image is totally going to change. Now that back wall has a much more granularity to the texture. You can see actual what looks like sand on top of it. That's how I see it at least. If I switch back to dedithering on, you're going to see that it softens way up. What I'm going to do now is show you a close-up on the red carpet on the right hand side of the screen. You're going to see right here as Mario takes a little lasagna nap, there is a jagged stepping to the pixels on that carpet. If we go ahead and turn anti-aliasing back on, watch that carpet, that line becomes so much smoother in the corner there. That is what anti-aliasing does. It's going to smooth out those jaggies for you. Now you can turn it on, you can turn it off. The great thing is Robert gives us all of these as toggles, so you can decide what works best for you on any individual game. But right now, with the current core, with all of these options in, this is extremely close to the full look of the Nintendo 64 hardware that you probably have sitting in your collection today. And that's the thing, there are still a few tiny little features to implement, but for the most part, this is going to be the most fundamental difference in the image you get on the core today. And that's the thing, if it's been a while since you played real Nintendo 64 hardware, you might not remember it being this blurry of an image, but that is what the original hardware back in the day did, and if you have hardware now, if you hook it up even to a PVM, you're still going to see that blur over top the screen. People call it the Vaseline effect. It's like if you smeared Vaseline on your screen. But if you go ahead and turn dedither off here, you're going to see that the wall, the sky, the ground now has much more texture in the image. We can go back and forth, turn it on, turn it off, and just watch that wall there. It goes from being almost sandy to having that blur atop of it. And that's what the artists at Nintendo and the developers intended you to see when you were playing the game. And I don't know what happened here. I've never actually run up the wall like that before. I don't think that's a bug. I think I just got lucky, but tell me down below if you know why that just happened. But again, spectacular, and we're going to come back to Mario in a bit and show you anti-aliasing as well one more time. But having Perfect Dark running on the current core is nothing short of amazing. There's so many talented people out there on the MiSTer Discords that are working on getting these things booting, even if TLB isn't currently here. And that's the thing about that feature that I showed in a video previously that I'll link below. Some games used it constantly, some games like Super Mario 64 only use it on boot, and games like Perfect Dark seem to apparently not use it that often whatsoever, because I've seen on Discord people are trying to beat this game and some people have been successful at runs on it. But this is another one of the heavy hitters on the Nintendo 64. This was a late game release for Rare and Nintendo, and it shows all of the power of what the Nintendo 64 could do. And now you see, when you always ask whether or not Perfect Dark is playable, it is now playable with a big asterisk. You just need to patch the TLB checks out of the game. That's not hard to do whatsoever, but it does not run on the current core if you just drop in the game itself. But this is also amazing. It's just so much fun to see this game now working on the core. And I know a lot of you have been wondering whether or not some of the later stage games would run from a technical feasibility standpoint outside of TLB. This is a heavy hitting graphical game. It would slow down on the Nintendo 64, and it seems like here, and from what I've read, by removing TLB, you're actually seeing a little bit of performance gain over using real hardware. This is smooth, this is fluid, it is amazing, and it sounds great too. Listen for 45 seconds, and I'll be right back.
Intruder alert! Waster! What a die!
spy! Use the comm spy!
Confirmed.
Target sighted.
Visually perfect dark on this core looks near to perfect. Even these pseudo fisheye effects when you're using some of the gadgets are drawing correctly as far as my memory is concerned. And again, this was a game that a lot of people commented on, wondering whether or not it would run correctly on the core, because it's a late stage release and it's one of the most graphically impressive games on the Nintendo 64. Obviously TLB has been patched out, but short of that, you can tell that Perfect Dark 64 in one way or another is achievable on the core. Now that doesn't mean the TLB version is going to be here next week, next month, or even next year. We got to wait for Robert to do that work, but if you want to play it today on the current core, you 100% can. And again, big thanks to Insane Friend for letting me use this footage for the video. But it's so much fun to see a game like Perfect Dark running on the core. This is an awesome first-person shooter, and I know that people are poking at GoldenEye to see if it's possible to remove the TLB checks. I do not have any information whether or not that'll happen or not, so before you leave that comment down below, you just kind of have to wait and see what happens. I do the same thing, but it's exciting when something randomly just starts working like Perfect Dark. Visually amazing, the sound was perfect. I don't see anything about this that does not look correct. But let's move back over to Banjo-Kazooie and talk about anti-aliasing and dedithering again. I know the terminology can be confusing because we have dither then dedither. You would think one would cancel out the other because it's basically just removing dither in a manner. That's just not how it works here. Don't worry about the nomenclature. Take a look at the grass there as we turn the dedither off on that wall. Both the painting as well as that grass texture just get a little bit more pixelated, but we really want to move around in game because the colorful nature of Banjo-Kazooie really lends itself to being able to show you the difference in texture when we're moving, not just stationary. But that is the hard thing about videos like this. Between YouTube compression and your eyes, depending on what screen you're watching, you may see more or less. But what I want to do back here is run and unfortunately end up getting gored by the bull. But take a look at this ground texture, this yellow here. It is blurry, it's smooth, you can barely tell that there's any actual pixels in it. And I'm going to switch the dedither off in real time and I'm going to end up getting hit for it. That grass is going to go from being smooth to now having that texture over top of it. It's one of those things. This is one of the easy places, at least for me, to be able to show it to you. That texture comes in and it goes away once we turn dedither on. It just brings up the blur that's synonymous with the Nintendo 64. And as we run up this hill here, watch the walls, watch the grass, watch this path. You can tell that it's blurry and you really can't detect individual pixels when the game is in motion. Now, some games are going to benefit more from this, some games are going to benefit less. The faster the game, the faster it moves, the less likely it is you're actually going to see that dedithering. But take a look at these walls here, this little stone hedge, everything is smooth. We come back in real time and we turn dedither off, and now they have a texture to them. But if we turn anti-aliasing off, you don't really see much. That's just because of the distance of the objects on the camera. But you can see the texture on those little stone hedge pillars. We turn dedither back on, and that texture goes away, and we now have a smooth experience. That is what these two new features in the current core are bringing to the table. Now, a game that everyone wanted to see retested and has improved since the last time I showed it to you is Pilotwings 64. Last time it had a lot of graphical glitches and it had bad sound quality. Now the graphics are much better and the sound is near perfect. Go ahead and listen, and I'll be right back. If you can't tell, when the game started to hitch, so did the audio. It kind of got a little bit reverby and a little bit staticky, but this is a game that you can play today. You can get through different levels and you can see it. And the last time I showed it, there was no skybox. It really had a lot of graphical corruption. But both Pilotwings as an update is working, and it's also another awesome game to check out that dedithering. So what we're going to do here is try to land in front of this building so you can get a good close-up. We're going to take a point deduction, but we're not trying to win. We're trying to talk about dithering. And as I turn dedither on and off, you're going to see in the background what happens. This is dedither on. That building is quite smeary, quite blurry. The game never really intended you to look at it this closely, but for a test we can do that. Now we'll turn dedither off, and you're going to see that that building now has again that granular texture to it. It almost feels like stucco or some sort of other popcorn ceiling or sand, if you know what I'm talking about. We turn dedither back on, and all of that goes away. And that's the thing about all of these effects. Depending on what game you're playing, depending on what genre it is, and depending on how close or far away you are from objects in the game world, you're going to notice the intensity or lack thereof. You'll see here when we're up in the sky, it's really impossible to tell whether or not dedither is on or off, but as you get closer to the ground, that's when it's going to become more apparent. In some games, it's not going to be obvious whatsoever. If it's a really fast moving game like a racing game, it's really going to be almost indetectable, but on platformers, things like Pilot Wings here, when you get close to the ground, you can tell the difference. And now you know you can complete at least the first 2 rounds of Pilot Wings with no issues except a little hitching. Now, a lot of you have wanted to see some tests of some of the different ROM hacks on the Nintendo 64 core. Big thanks to Andy D. He sent this to me like a week ago and I meant to feature it in a video. But people, special modders, have been working on getting a recompilation project of the source code for Super Mario 64 running at 60 frames a second. And people were really curious as to whether or not this would run on the current MiSTer core. And I'm here to tell you, obviously this footage is from the core, so it does work, but it works with a few caveats. In the intro here, as Mario pops out of the pipe, it's running in 60 frames a second, no issues whatsoever. And it's pretty plainly obvious to tell the fluidity in his movement is massively improved when this game is running at a locked 60 frames a second. The thing, at least on the current core, and I did test this earlier today before I did the voiceover just to check, is that the speed will fluctuate. Sometimes it's going to drop down to a lower frame rate than would be on the original Nintendo 64 game if you're playing it on the core. In other instances, it's going to run at double speed plus as far as the fluidity of the frame pacing is concerned. It does run smoother, but it doesn't change the speed of the game whatsoever. But you'll see here, as less objects are on screen, now that fluidity does come back. So it seems to be something going on with the core and with the ROM hack, where the more things on screen at once, the less likely it's going to be to actually run at that 60 frames a second target rate. But there's so much fun just to see this actually happening in real time. It's fun to be able to play around with these ROM hacks, but what really it means is that we have to test these against real hardware too, because it is difficult to say where the problem may occur, whether it's in the core or whether it's in the implementation in the ROM hack code, and it might do the same thing on original hardware. But you'll see here, everything runs really smoothly until we turn the corner, and then you can instantly tell that the in-engine frame rate lowers, and that actually lowers the game with it. It doesn't drop frames, it doesn't have any screen tearing, it actually slows down the physics of the engine itself. But if we go to a less populated area and run around the L is Real fountain right here, you can see the absolute smoothness of this hack. Hopefully it improves on the core, but it's fun just to see it running because you guys were curious. Now back to vanilla Super Mario 64, I wanted to touch on anti-aliasing one more time, because compared to dedither, it is a harder feature to show. So let's just walk around a little bit here, kill a few enemies, then we'll pop up here to the snowman head, because I want to use his eye as an example of what anti-aliasing does on not straight lines. It just shows you what the core implementation is doing and gives you a decent look, but trying to actually get his eye in frame, not the easiest thing in the world. But watch the circle around his eye. It's a pretty clean circle. We turn anti-aliasing off, that circle increases, and you can see the jagginess come up and down. On, off. You can see a fundamental difference here with anti-aliasing on or off. In motion, if you were just running by the snowman's head, you would probably never notice. But that's what I really want to use as an example here. These features, at least some of them, dedither anti-aliasing, get so much closer to the look of a real Nintendo 64, but sometimes you have to actually look for the instances and where they are, because on the snowman here jumping towards us, anti-aliasing, you just really couldn't tell. Now everyone's been asking about Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2, and I wanted to put a test in here. It does run. The intro does some very weird things. There's graphical corruption, there's some hitching and freezing, but if you just hit start enough times, you can get into the actual game and start playing. This is not perfect, but everyone wanted to know about Tony Hawk Pro Skater, and I totally get that. This was a huge game back in the day, and people are just painfully curious to see whether or not it's working on the current core. It is playable. I don't think it's perfect, obviously, but you can play it today. And just so you know, the playable percentage just went above 80% by like a decimal point. That is just for the North American library, but as of this morning, 80% plus of North American Nintendo 64 games are playable on the current core. With TLB missing, that definitely keeps the percentage down to that 80% mark, but pretty much 4 out of every 5 North American Nintendo 64 games you try to play on the core today are going to get you in-game and you're going to be able to play them. And considering this was thought to be the impossible core, and then Robert thought that we'd have one playable game by Christmas, I would say that this is definitely possible and definitely way ahead of schedule. Now moving over to the original San Francisco Rush, a lot of you guys asked me to retest this game because last time I tested it, it didn't run at full speed and there was graphical corruption. Now this is just the San Francisco Rush you know and love. But this is also an example of where dedither and anti-aliasing are basically impossible to see. It wouldn't matter if a line was straight or not on this game. You're moving so fast through the world, you would have to pause and look at it just to see what was going on. And I'm going to change some options in real time as I play around, and both as I give you a sound sample so you can just watch for them. But it's one of those things, not every single game is going to be obvious what functions are on and off just because of the speed of the engine. But go ahead and have a sound sample of San Francisco Rush as well, because it's got some real muffled audio, but that's inherent to the actual game. Listen, and I'll be right back. I gave you that sound example not because I think the sound quality in San Francisco Rush is amazing. I give it to you because I get a lot of comments saying that they think sound is muffled in certain games, and that is just because in some games it is on real hardware. But I love how this ends right here. I take this jump, I land on top of a car, and it throws me into the wall to explode. Great way to end the footage. But right now, if you play the Nintendo 64 core on MiSTer FPGA, some games basically just feel legit straight up like real hardware. I'm not trying to blow smoke up your you-know-what. You play Super Mario 64 with the TLB patch not showing Mario's face in the beginning, and after that, outside of a few tiny graphical effects that aren't there yet, you would be hard-pressed to tell it wasn't real hardware. And that is as good as it can get right now. Short of that, I'll see you guys next time. Go play some Nintendo 64. Bye-bye.